Hey everyone, so I'm going to be showing you my final project for my multimedia curriculum project. So my project focused on flipping Esperanza Rising. So just some background information about my classes and our school before I get started. So I teach two sections of 5th grade ELA. I have 25 students in each class, and I have 12 ENL students in total that are placed in either one of the classes depending on which level they are at. I also do have an ENL teacher that comes in one period per class, so she comes in 2 times a day, and she does happen to come in during my module period, which is probably the most difficult part of the day, so she is a great help and a lot of support for those students. So I'm at William Floyd Elementary, and we have an A and B week rotating schedule for the computer lab. Each class gets a double period every other week. If NWEI is taking place, teachers are allowed to take their students to the computer lab that we have in the library, because at that time library lessons are not taking place because our librarian is administering the NWEA testing. So just an overview and learning objectives that I had for my project. So students took part in a new flipped classroom model where they used different Google apps and different tools that we had in the classroom, such as our Polyvision board. We did go to the computer lab and used other sources of internet to further expand different learning styles and different information about the 1930s and about the novel Esperanza Rising by Pam Eunice Ryan. So the objective was for students to be able to complete assignments digitally for Module 1, Unit 2, which is Esperanza Rising, through Google Sites. And I found Google Sites to just be a lot easier for my students to access. I did have a difficult time getting all of the internet forms back from each student, so I was not able to create a Google account for all of them. So I found that Google Sites, at least I was able to make it accessible to anyone, and all they had to do was click the link and use all the tools that I had out there. I still really do want to use Google Classroom, but that is going to be a project that I'm going to focus on later on. But the objective, again, it was for my students to use Google Sites, where they were able to access comprehension quizzes, different references, audio files, videos, vocabulary reviews, and other project-based learning tools. So this is just an overview of the lessons that I did with my students. There were 9 lessons. Not every lesson took place in our computer lab. Some of them did take place in our own classroom where we just used the Polyvision board. At some times I had students sit at our Polyvision board. I do have a wireless mouse and a wireless keyboard, and they were able to access things in the classroom with just their small group. And then sometimes we did things whole class as well. Those lessons were like teaching my students how to look for scholarly sources or how to use Google Slides. Those are lessons that I did in the classroom whole class where my students really just listened. They really weren't very active in the lesson. I'm just going to focus on some of my lessons, the ones that were really worthy and beneficial to my students directly. So lesson 1 was a vocabulary review that I created for them. So I have A weeks and B weeks, and on A weeks I give my students spelling words. Those words I focus on a spelling principle, and my students are able to choose the words that they would like to study for the week. And these words can be from absolutely anywhere. It could be from books, writing, words that they constantly get wrong, words that they've heard that are new, whichever words they would like, as long as they know what they mean. But on B weeks, I choose the words for them, and I focus on words that do come from the module. And this is just an example of what the teacher guide looks like on one of the pages, and for each lesson it does give you vocabulary to focus on that will come up in the lesson. And I've found in the past that it has helped tremendously giving these words as a preview before the lessons, because then they understood why I gave them those words and how they were applicable to our lessons. So with this lesson, what I did was I created a slideshow for my students. So on Fridays, they are given the 10 words and 10 definitions that are all mixed up. And their homework on Fridays, for most of them, it is to look in a dictionary and figure out which words go with which definitions. Certain students I actually just give the slideshow directly to, and all they have to do is copy the word and the definition in their notebook. Those are like my ENL kids and some students who just really struggle with academics in total. So then after that, what I did was I gave them the slideshow to the rest of the class, and my students use it as a game so that they can practice memorizing their words. So all they have to do is access our class website, and on the links there's vocabulary. All they have to do is click vocabulary, and depending on which week it is, I just continue to add different slideshows. And like I said, they can use this to study their vocabulary words, and they can also use it to check their words to make sure that they did choose the right vocabulary word to go with the correct definition. And the way the slideshow works is I made it where on each slide just the definition comes up first. So for example, this is to accept the guidance of a leader, and then after a few seconds, the word will pop up. And what I did this for was so that my students could look at just the definition and try to think of the word in their head, so that they were able to become more self-aware and realize which words they still needed to practice. So then it just pops up like that. Here's just another example. Again, just the definition. And I also add pictures just so that they can apply those visuals to the definition and the word as well. And then the word pops up. And then again, definition, pictures, and then the word pops up. So that's just one example, and there's numerous examples. And they can also print them out. I've also told them if they would like to print them out and use them as flashcards, they could totally use them for that as well. Next is lesson 2. So my students are required to read Esperanza Rising independently. It is a level V, and it's supposed to be read in the beginning of the school year, even though 5th graders are supposed to be on a level S in 5th grade in the beginning of the year. So it's very difficult to expect my students to be able to read this book independently when they're really supposed to only be in S right now. And what also makes the text so difficult is that there is a lot of Spanish vocabulary in it. So what I decided to do was create audio files for my students to be able to access at home or in school so that they could follow along in the book and listen to me read as well. So the audio files were made by me completely. I'm very fortunate enough that I also know how to speak and read in Spanish, so I was able to use that to be able to help my students understand those vocabulary words, what they sound like, what they look like. So I found it beneficial for me to even just do audio files rather than me trying to just look for them somewhere. So the way that the students access that is, again, they just go to our class website, and at the top there's a link for Esperanza Rising. They just click that. When you scroll down, all the chapters are there. And depending on which chapter we're on, I don't give my students access to the ones that I haven't assigned yet. So they don't have access to chapter 5 and forward because we haven't assigned that yet. Last chapter we read was chapter 4. So all they would have to do is click the link and an audio file pops up. They can wear their headphones as long as they are following along in the book. That's what I always tell my students. That is the most important thing for me. And then they click play.
Page 39.
They can listen to my voice.
Figs. The wind blew hard that night, and the house moaned and whistled. Instead of dreaming of birthday songs, Esperanza's sleep was filled with nightmares.
All right, and that's just an example. So after they finish reading the chapter and follow along in the chapter, and I always tell them you can choose whether or not you want to read it on your own or you can follow along with me. I always really highly recommend it because it is done at home or it is done in class if they were not able to do it at home. But I just really want them to be able to at least get the literal comprehension of the book, and then in class is where I focus on deeper meaning. So at home, you don't need to ask anyone to help to read it with you. Just listen to the audio, and it helps tremendously. It also helps tremendously with my students who are always getting constantly pulled out of class. So after they finish reading the chapter, as an assessment, I have different comprehension quizzes that I created on Google Forms for my students. So again, all they have to do is go to our class website, and there's a drop-down menu on Esperanza Rising, comprehension quizzes. Chapters 1 and 2 I did do on paper, because that's how I've always done it in the past, but I did chapter 3 through Google Forms, and I did create it with long answer text, so I wanted them to be able to write out their answers. But for this, I did have to still individually look at each person's test and grade it on my own. And then when I did a peer review, the person who reviewed my project suggested that I use multiple choice so that it would grade it for me. So I decided to do that for the next chapter, which was chapter 4. And it did help a lot. It was really nice to be able to see the results so quickly. And it really saved me a lot of time. But I use this just to make sure that my students were able to understand what happened in the story before I get into the deeper meaning of what happened in the chapter. Then for lesson 5, so my students used Google Docs to color code and answer extended response questions that are related to the chapters of Esperanza Rising. So I use this strategy called the RACE strategy, and it's to restate the question, answer in your own words, cite where you found your evidence, and then to write down the evidence. And I've always done it on paper where they write the word race at the top using a different color for each letter. And then in their answer, if they wrote the letter R in red, their restated question has to be in red. If they wrote the letter A in yellow, their answer in their own words has to be in yellow. And I've always done that on paper, and it's just a way for them to visually notice that they are answering a question completely. So I decided to just make it a little more fun and use technology instead of on paper, and have them practice their typing. So this is just an example of what one of my students did. This is Andy. So the question was, how does Mama respond to Theodolus's proposal after the fire? So again, he decided that the restated was in R, answer in your own words was in yellow, cite was in blue, and evidence was in green. And then he created his answer. And if you notice, it's just color-coded. So it's in purple, in yellow, in blue, and in green. So I was able to notice what he used to restate his question, answer in his own words, cite, and what evidence he used. And they had an awesome time with this. They really loved doing it. They thought it was like a game, which is awesome. And the last lesson that I'm going to focus on is our final lesson, which was lesson 9, which was to create a Google slide presentation on a historical event that took place during the setting of Esperanza Rising. So the lesson previous to this, I focused on different scholarly sources that my students could use to be able to do their research. And usually what I do is on our class website, I have a link for favorite sites. And this is where I just add different links that I want them to use for their research so that they don't stray away and focus on websites that may not be so reliable. So after I gave them all different scholarly resources, I did put them into groups, and I was able to give certain students access to certain slideshows. And because it is a live slide, I told each student they're responsible for one slide on their presentation that was going to focus on a specific topic. So it was either the Great Depression, there was migration, there was the Dust Bowl. There were quite a few topics. And this is just one example that one of my students did, a group of my students. And they focused on the Great Depression, and they did get a rubric, and I told them that their requirements was that on each slide there had to be at least 4 facts and at least 2 pictures. And with the slideshow, after we finished all of them, we shared it with each student through our Polyvision board in our classroom, and they were able to give the students, their peers, just information on the topics. So this one, like I said, is on the Great Depression. It's just one example. And, they had a really great time doing it, and it really was a tool that was great to use for them to be able to learn the information themselves and to hit that level of mastery, be able to teach it to other people. All right, well, that's my project. Thank you so much for listening.